The concept of a reduced fat diet really speaks for itself, and all I really want to do in this tutorial is look at the benefits and the drawbacks of that, but just be reminded that if we're talking about the typical diet, we're talking about something like 25 to 30% of the nutritional intake of an average balanced diet would be based around lipids or fat. So just bear that one in mind. It's something, there's a substantial quantity of nutrition there that can be cut back on if that's something that is of interest to the person. So let's think about doing that. What would be the benefits of consuming less fat? Because of course it's one of those things that we think of, yeah, definitely this is good for us, this is healthy, etc., etc. But what's the reality and what might the impact be? Well, we get a total fat storage reduction. So the storage of fat around the body is reduced, and we're broadly saying, apart from in extreme cases, that this is a positive thing. Of course, what this is going to mean is that a person is lighter because their body weight, because they're effectively carrying less fat, their body weight will go down. Now, it won't necessarily go down rapidly, but it will decrease. Now, start to think about some of the impacts of that. If we assume, for example, that someone is a little bit heavy before they follow this process, as body weight comes down, when that person, for example, is taking part in a PE lesson, let's say, they're going to find that the contraction of their muscles, actually, as strong as maybe they were before, is going to propel that person further because that person is light. In other words, their power to weight ratio is going to be better, so they're going to find themselves more effective. Another point we've got here is that lighter weight, so someone who is lighter than they were before, depending on, obviously you don't want to get lighter if you're already very light, but it can or it could make you feel healthier. Okay, so you might have a healthier sense because a little bit of weight has been lost, and you feel that sort of vibrancy of feeling a little bit better, right? Now, again, it depends on one's start point. We're making an assumption here that someone's doing this because they feel a little bit heavy. We don't want to be losing weight if we're already very light or of a good weight, of course. The other thing we can say here is that it's really beneficial, especially if, and here's my ... especially if we cut back trans and animal fats. Okay, so animal fats are obviously things like dairy, butter, lard. If we cut back on those, that's positive because they're considered to be sort of bad fats in this sense. They can clog arteries, for example. Trans fats we tend to get in highly processed and fast foods. Think about the fats you get in your burgers, in your cream cakes, in your sweets, in your Haribo, etc., etc., etc. That's what we're talking about there. Those ones are the ones that are seen as quite negative, and therefore you get particular benefits that way. Next, and I've touched on this already, we get fewer fat deposits. And where do these fat deposits go? This is something we've talked about, in the blood. So just a reminder, I've drawn this out a couple of times depending on which tutorials of mine you've watched. If this is an artery, what happens if we eat a lot of fat can kind of build up as little kind of deposits in the blood and on the walls of the artery this way. So the blood that's trying to squeeze through experience, of course, higher pressure as a result of that. So less fat consumed, less tendency for these deposits to be there. I'm going to come back to that point in a moment when we talk about types of fat again. Now, another way of wording this is we could say that this person has experienced reduced cholesterol. Okay, so reduced cholesterol. This is going to have the impact of reduced BP or reduced blood pressure. Blood pressure is going to go down. And last point, I haven't really left myself space to do it, so I'll pop it in here. We get a reduced down arrow chance of coronary heart disease. So the tendency to get conditions like angina or heart attack, and of course we're talking about much later in life, in the vast majority of cases, a teenager is extremely unlikely to experience coronary heart disease, but people in the UK in their middle and later stage of life often experience coronary heart disease. And one of the ways of avoiding that is to not consume too many fats, and especially not consuming too many trans and animal fats. So there are significant benefits on controlling or even reducing the fat intake that we have, but there are drawbacks, and sometimes these are not discussed. I mean, it's broadly accepted really that low fat is a good thing, right? Well, what are the negatives to this? First of all, fat is necessary, and we could say here it's a necessary nutrient. It's part of a healthy diet. So if you cut back on it a little bit, fine, but if you cut it out, not so good. Secondly, If we have fewer healthy fats, and remember there are healthy fats, your vegetable-based fats, your olive oils, for example. If we stop taking those on board, this can inhibit. Inhibit means get worse or prevent. That's what inhibit means. Inhibit cholesterol control. So you remember that cholesterol control. So you remember that little drawing I made up here of that artery. One of the things that can help reduce these fatty deposits is actually plant-based fats. Okay, so if we stop taking those on board, maybe we're less effective at breaking these deposits down. So we do need some fats. They're actually healthy. These are what are called good fats or healthy fats, and we do need to take on board some of them. Also, and just as a general point, we want to say fat has a function. So if we cut it out altogether, we are denying our body a nutrient that it needs. So what are the functions? Well, the obvious ones are low intensity exercise. Your body works best when it's exercising, maybe in a warm-up during a PE lesson, from fats. Okay, so low intensity exercise is powered by fats. Another function of fat is it's used for insulation. Of course, it's under the skin, that can help keep you warm, but also it's around organs and insulates organs. But the other thing it does, because it's around those organs, is it protects vital organs. Now, we are talking about an extreme case where someone's body fat percentage goes so low that they wouldn't have much of that. That's really, really serious. That's something that would be a hyper elite athlete or someone who's experiencing probably an eating disorder is going to be experiencing problems of that nature, but it's worth mentioning all the same. I also want to say that fats are needed for cell health. So your cells, so of course of which you've got billions, as we've mentioned at least once before, the cell membrane, which of course controls what goes in and out of the cell membrane is a lipid, okay? It's a fat, therefore we need fats to go ahead and fulfill that function. And two more points I just want to address with you. The penultimate one is that what happens a lot of the time is if we reduce fat, so if we take on less fat, this can often lead, I'll just use a different color to this, to increase carbs. So we have to obviously replace that energy with something. So if we replace energy with carbs, if we replace fat with carbs, what often happens here is that someone can experience what would be described as bloating and heaviness. Water retention is another example of where if we eat too many carbs, we get water retention in the belly and around the gut. Okay, so that's something which is relatively negative. And then finally, another thing that's associated, so if we've got low fat in our diet, what that often leads to as well is this time not high protein, but low fats often lead to low protein intake. Now remember, proteins are for growth and repair. So if, for example, we're not eating meat or fish or things that are sources of fat, but also sources of protein, it might mean that we're getting less protein in our diet. And of course, this can affect things like growth, which is really important for young people, of course, and repair. And that growth and repair is also, they're both really important when it comes to sort of the concept of getting fitter. And if you're doing things like weight training or sport or exercise or movement, our body becomes fitter and changes through the process of growth and repair of things like muscle and tendon tissue, and that requires protein. If we're having less fat in our diet, we may find we're having less protein in our diet because they often come together, and we've got to be cautious not to do that. So those are things to consider if you are interested in a reduced fat diet. Certainly reducing from 25% is not a bad thing, but you don't want to be going towards 0% fat intake. Apart from extreme cases like only some specific elite athletes, this is not where you want to be. Okay, and you certainly can't be there consistently. What you want to perhaps consider is that reduced fat diets are effective for reducing weight if this is brought down to maybe 20 to 25% rather than 25 to 30%. Over time, that could be a way to reduce weight if somebody felt they wanted to do that. Thanks.